Okay, so I'm going to do the top 10 factions overall in Third Age, I think. And this is going to be interspersed with my own opinion in quite a few places. It's also not going to be a terribly long video because I'm not going to explain the ins and outs in their entirety of why I think the factions are laid out in the way they are, because I've already talked through each faction in a fair amount of detail as it is. So I'll just be explaining why they are in the position they are on the list relative to what is around them, what's above them, and what's just below them. But yeah, I think that this is a good one. I had it requested, so I think it's a good idea, but it's also something which I was reluctant to do because it is going to be down to my opinion a little bit again, which, you know, is debatable. Nonetheless, we'll start in at number 10. So at number 10 we have Harad, and now while my opinion does come into this, it's not the only determining factor, because if it were just my opinion I would put Harad quite a bit higher on the list, to be honest with you. But I have to admit that from a purely unit to unit effectiveness way of looking at things, Harad do lose out to some other factions in terms of their overall unit quality, which can harm them, especially in higher funds games. In lower funds games, Harad would probably be higher than 10th, but in the sort of funds you'll probably be playing online, Harad will probably be somewhere around 10th. This is the sort of standard-ish sort of unit composition you would expect to see as Harad. You have, you know, a decent archer force. It's not going to be able to defeat something like Dale or the Elves. It's going to lose to a few factions, but it's still a cost-efficient archer line. And also you'll notice that there are a lot of spear units and pike units. Again, these are very cost effective. It means you're going to be able to field a lot of them without feeling it too heavily on your budget. There are also the trollmen, which these guys, you'll probably see them in most Harad armies just because they are pretty survivable. They do a fair amount of damage. They aren't really as good as most heavy infantry, most standard heavy infantry, but they will pad out the line, make it more survivable. You'll definitely be seeing Serpent Guard. This is Harad's only unit of real, genuine quality on foot that can go toe-to-toe with a lot of other stuff in melee in terms of quality. They're a very good unit. They'll be able to hold the line against stuff which is technically better than them. In addition to the amount of spears you have, you should be able to do pretty well in terms of just holding a line straight up. You may start to lose the archer fight if you're against one of the archer heavy factions, but where Harad's real strength lies is in their mounted units, it must be said. And you can field a lot of Serpent Guard. Like, you can field 3, but I fielded, I usually field 4, but in this situation I fielded 3 just to show that if you back them up with a Muhad Beastmasters unit, you can often win the cav engagements all the time because the Muhad Beastmasters are an anti-cav unit. And then this will tip the cav fight in your favour, provided you can get all the enemy cav sort of tied down. You can start firing into them with these, and it will allow you to win the cav battle, and then you can use what's left of the Serpent Guard to go around charging the enemy while your foot army holds the line, which they should be able to do. And if you needed to put the cav battle even more into your favour, you can always swing over one of the 4 spears that you've got. You're going to be able to afford a lot of warband and a lot of pikes, so there's no danger of you being outgunned in terms of cavalry. Even Arnel are gonna think twice before charging recklessly into your lines when you're playing as Harad, but ultimately the quality of their units isn't enough to get them higher on the list, although if it were my personal opinion they'd probably be around 4th. Okay, so coming in at number 9 we have the Sylvan Elves. Now, some people may put the Sylvan Elves a little higher, but I'm inclined to disagree for reasons that I've mentioned numerous times before when I've been talking about the Elves. But really, what their strength is their archer force. And this is a sort of typical Sylvan Elven army that you'll be going up against, where they will be very defensive and they will be relying on their archers to equalize the numbers a little bit, and then allowing their quality to do most of the legwork by having a rather tight formation. They won't be aggressive. If you're against the Sylvan Elves, they will almost certainly not be aggressive, especially not in a field battle. But yeah, their archers are going to be the core of what makes them so dangerous, including their general's bodyguard, which is their Sindar arch unit, of course. A lot of damage these guys can do. You're not going to win a skirmish fight against the Elves. Dale can try, and the High Elves obviously can pretty much be equal to the Sylvan Elves, but other than that, you're going to pretty easily win the skirmish fight. You don't have pikes, but you do have something which is just as good and arguably better in some ways in the excellent spear units that the elves have, so you're going to be able to hold the line for a long, long time. The one weakness that these guys do have is trolls. If you're up against Mordor, you will not be able to hold the line as well as pikes will. They'll just kind of smash through. In that eventuality, you will probably have to use your woodland warriors and your swordsmen in order to kill them as quickly as possible, because these are your high damage units. The woodland warriors are particularly good against the uruk-hai because they are armor piercing. In order to pad out your army as well, you're going to be needing to use the sylvan spearmen. These are the cheapest unit you have available. They're a good spear unit as well, very good spear unit. But nonetheless, you do have the problem in which you are almost entirely dependent on your archers to win you a fight, especially in an open field battle. You of course can field horse archers as well, which can add to your maneuverability in this respect. However, the problem that you will have as a Sylvan Elf is these guys will be chased around and harried by enemy melee cav almost all the time. Unless you use these guys defensively as well, sort of behind your lines, moving around, making sure that it's not as easy for you to get flanked, they're not going to see a lot of use. But yeah, that's really the problem that I have with the Elves. While you can, a lot of people I know like to play defensively like this, where you sort of let your archers do a lot of the work. For me, it just leaves you too vulnerable. It means you're giving the enemy the initiative, and that's why the Sylvan Elves don't get higher, despite the fact they are very, very good at it indeed. In fact, there is one faction I believe that is better than it, because of the units around the archers are all more useful and better, in my opinion. Still, that's the Sylvan Elves, and now we'll move on to number 8. So, at number 8, we have potentially one of the more dangerous evil factions in Isengard. Now, Isengard are a faction which are forced to be aggressive most of the time. Their crossbows are good, but the problem is you can be out-skirmished simply because of their range. You need to come into the range of a lot of the composite bow units. This isn't like Medieval 2, where the crossbows are pretty much the best skirmishers across the board. Here, the fact that the range is lower for the crossbows compared to composite bows, you're going to have a little bit of an issue. Nonetheless, Isengard are a pretty savage faction when it comes to dishing out damage. Their crossbows, of course, very good against armoured units, whether that be mounted or dismounted. They also have some very nice melee units. Now, the Dunland veterans, they're pretty much your cannon fodder units, honestly, in most situations. They're going to be the lowest tier of unit that you field in a sort of mid to high funds game. They're okay in terms of stats, and they will do their job relatively well. They're not the sort of unit where they're only there for a meat shield. If they get into melee, they won't just fold immediately. They will do some damage. But nonetheless, it's not where the main danger lies for your army. You have much better mainline infantry in the uruk-hai infantry, and you're likely to see a lot more of these. There's a lot more in each unit, and they are better in terms of stats. They have nicer armor as well. These guys are actually pretty good as long as you can keep them in the fight. They break more easily than the infantry of the Kingdoms of Men, and that's pretty much the only problem with them. Other than that, they are a very, very reliable unit that you can use to overwhelm the enemy, and that's the key when playing as one of the Orc factions, Isengard included, is you're going to have more men in the unit. You can overwhelm the enemy with numbers rather than outright quality, which the Kingdoms of Men and the Elves and the Dwarves all rely on. The most dangerous unit you have at your disposal, though, is certainly the Berserkers, and this is kind of the opposite. The most dangerous unit you have at your disposal, though, is the Berserkers, and this is kind of the opposite mindset coming into play. This is a unit of extreme quality. They're very, very good. They're basically, like I've said before, Trolls Light, in the sense that they will last an awful long time. They've got 3 hit points. They'll do a great deal of damage as well. They're ideal for clearing off walls, but even in a pitch battle, if you get these guys in the line, especially if they're supporting something like your pikes or your infantry, you're going to be able to cleave through sections of the enemy's line, and there's not a lot they can do about it. The only thing I would say is that where your line has Berserkers, you're probably going to win that area of the fight. Where it doesn't, you may well end up losing it. That's just tends to be how it goes. There will probably be a limit of about 3 on the Berserkers, maybe 2. But I would say that, even so, these guys are going to be the key to victory if you're playing as Isengard most of the time. They're certainly very important. Another very important unit to you is your pikes. Now, as Isengard, you'll be able to mass up your pikemen nice and easily. They have a lot of pikes per unit, so they're very difficult to break down. They are, of course, vulnerable to archers, but you can't really do a great deal about that. The only problem with Isengard using their pikes in a pitch battle is Isengard tend to be forced onto the offensive against most other factions because they can be outranged in terms of skirmish. Pikes are not really useful when you're using them aggressively. That's why I've put them at the back, because generally speaking, you're going to want to use your melee infantry to go in and engage the enemy, then bring the pikes up behind them to just sort of reinforce your position, and that's how you'll win the battle. And of course, the Guards of Orthanc are a good unit to put your general in because they are very survivable, difficult to kill. They're not actually very effective overall when you're using them on the offensive, but if you put them into skill trom, your general shouldn't die, which is more important for the Orc factions than it is for any other, because if your general dies, the morale hit is real. And that's really why Isengard don't really get any higher on this list. It is some of that Orc mentality where they are easier to break, and that psychology is going to be playing against you, and they also don't have the high-end toys that some of the other factions have, some of the other Orc factions have, that would push them higher on the list. Nonetheless, we'll move on to number 7. Okay, so number 7, we have the High Elves, and what puts these guys ahead of the Sylvan Elves, in my opinion, is the fact that they have much more in terms of high-end infantry, and melee infantry in general, which of course is very, very important when it comes to the mechanics of Medieval 2. Of course, they have a similar archer line to the Sylvan Elves, but chances are you'll be seeing them field a slightly less elite archer line than the Sylvan Elves, because they're slightly less dependent on it. So you'll probably see lower tier archers like the Bow Quindi, although to call these guys low tier is to do the elves a bit of a disservice. But yeah, you'll probably see them mixed in with the Eldar Enway units and such. You will also see quite a lot of low tier infantry from the High Elves, well, sort of mid tier I'd say, like Linden Longspears and Sword Quindi. These guys are good, but they aren't really anything too special either. Where the real excellence comes is in their high-end infantry and in some of their cavalry as well. Obviously you have the spears. These guys will pretty much do exactly the same thing as the Sylvan Elves units will. But it's really these 3 units back here that you're going to want to watch out for if you're facing the High Elves. The Mithlon Nobles and the Smiths of Eregion are both very, very good heavy infantry units, and they are going to be able to beat most infantry that is in front of them, and they are so difficult to kill, especially if they're able to get into a position where you can't really outflank them, and they have you fighting in a very narrow engagement. Then you're going to be in trouble. The Elves, of course, will struggle in terms of a map like this, obviously, because it's very open, very easy to outmaneuver them with the lower units they have. However, they do have cav of their own, which is something that the Sylvan Elves kind of lack. And these Eldar Enway Lancers, while they are expensive, you may very well see them simply because of how effective they can be. Chances are, though, they will be outnumbered, so if you're playing as a cav-heavy faction against the High Elves, you will probably have the cav advantage. Even if they bring a full stack of Eldar Enway Lancers, that means they have sacrificed a lot in their main line. So that's worth saying. I think that the High Elves are a good faction in the right hands, but in the wrong hands they can be very easily beaten. Similar to the Sylvan Elves, only I would suggest that the High Elves are a little bit better because they have better infantry at the high end, and that is pretty damn important in this submod. So, we'll have a look at number 6. Okay, so number 6 we have Rune, and I've mentioned in the past that Rune are a faction who suffer a little bit from the same problem as the Elves, where their army gets to be pretty expensive, and that's what makes you unable to compete with some of the very high-end factions. However, Rune suffer from this problem a little less, mainly because it's of their own making rather than a conceptual problem with the faction itself. Because Rune do have good units across the board, it's just that the high-end units are not enough in number, and they get very expensive because of the price increases per unit. They do have very good mid-tier units in the shape of these Clan Guard. They are a good unit because they will not beat like a lot of very elite heavy infantry, but they will do damage, and this is a good compromise to make in your army. Whereas others will have to punt for like very low tier units in order to pad out their army, you will have these guys, and they'll do a decent job for you. They can die fairly easily because they don't have shields to archers, but nonetheless, if you get them into the melee fight and get them into a line battle, they will do a decent amount of damage. As Rune, you also have good skirmishers. You can either go for a full contingent of Nar Rim, which will allow you to at least decently hold your own against anyone else in the game, or you can go more crossbow heavy, which of course means you're going to have to be careful of being outranged, but it does mean that you're going to be able to shoot down a lot of heavily armoured infantry, but more particularly cavalry that comes near you. You're going to be able to do a great deal of damage to that. Your own cavalry as well is pretty good. You'll probably have to use Horse Guard for the most part because they are cheaper and pretty effective anyway. The Innis Rim, I've got the General in them. The Innis Rim are very expensive, almost prohibitively so, considering the kind of faction that Rune is. They are very good, but you will still lose to certain factions, stuff like Arnel and Gondor, with the Innis Rim, so it's not really worth spending even more than they will on their cavalry, just to try and do as much damage to them as possible when you're going to lose that anyway. You also have Clan Warriors. These guys are even lower tier than the Clan Guard. If you need to pad out your army anymore, which you probably will, just get a couple of units of these to sort of fill the gaps in your army. Make sure you have full numbers to go up against anyone with. That way you can use these guys to sort of plug the gap where needed. They're not going to win you any fights, but they will help your line hold. You also have the Flag Rim. This is your main heavy infantry. They're a very, very good unit, the Flag Rim. You're going to be able to go toe-to-toe with most other elite heavy infantry in the game, and it's something which a lot of the other lower tier factions really lack, especially a faction like Rohan or Eriador. They don't have a unit like this, which is what puts Rune up on this list so high and above the Elves, in my opinion, because while the High Elves do have very high-end heavy infantry, they're not really terribly more effective than these Flag Rim. The Flag Rim are cheaper, and they do fit into Rune very, very well. And the final component to a runic army you'll see are the Gamp Rim. Now the Gamp Rim, in my opinion, are one of the best halberd slash pike units in the game because they seem to just hold and hold and hold forever. To a greater extent than some of the other pike units as well. I would hesitate to say that outside of Gondor, this might be the best pike unit in the game. Like, it's going to be a close run thing between themselves, the Dwarven Vault Wardens, and the uruk-hai pike unit because of their numbers. But to mention them in the same breath as a Dwarven pike unit is, just flattery for them really, because they are very, very good indeed. One of the best units you can field. That's the thing with Rune. You have some very, very elite aspects to your army, but you are forced to compromise in places, like the Horse Guard and the Clan Warriors, and that compromise is really what puts you below some of the higher tier factions, because some of the higher tier factions don't really have to compromise at all. So we shall move on to the top 5 now. So at number 5 is, in my opinion, the best evil faction in the game, and that is Mordor. Now, Mordor are cut from the same cloth as, honestly, the two worst factions in the game, the Orcs of Gundabad and the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. But where Mordor differ is they have much better base units, and they have better units at the high end. That's not to say you won't have trash in your Orc army, because you will. I've used Orc Raiders here as the example of the trash that they use. But you could see Orc Bands just as easily in this place, or Orc Maulers, depending on the kind of army that your opponent wants to build. Generally speaking, you're going to have to rush into the enemy army, because you will not be winning the skirmish battle, and you need to make sure that as many Orcs as possible make it to the enemy lines so you can overwhelm them. If you stand back and get shot by arrows, you're just playing into pretty much every other faction's hands if you do that. You will also probably see the Morin on Guard. These are the best of the kind of lower tier units that Mordor can field. They're a pretty good spear unit, honestly, and they will be able to go toe-to-toe with quite a lot of the spears of other factions, and they are an ideal support unit for the Mordor mainline infantry. Speaking of which, we will get onto that right now. The Uruks. Now, these guys are better than the Orcs of the Misty Mountains and the Orcs of Gundabad heaviest infantry. Excuse me. And really what puts these guys ahead is their stats, of course. They will do a decent job. They can break easily. Like I mentioned with the uruk-hai infantry, they can break. The Uruks break slightly easier than them. But the Uruks also, I would say, fit into Mordor's strategy of just swamping the enemy a little bit better. I think Mordor are better at swarming the enemy than Isengard are, simply because that's the kind of strategy they're forced to employ. The Uruk archers are not terrible, I suppose, but they aren't brilliant either. They will lose skirmish battles, but you should still bring some skirmishes, so you have that option. You also have the Uruk halberds. Now, these guys are not quite as good as the Isengard pikes, but I would say that they also fit Mordor a little bit better. Halberds, of course, do a little bit more damage. They're a little bit more suited for rushing in and doing that sort of thing, but they will still die pretty quickly, so you've got to be careful. If you can use these guys in the same way as the Isengard pikes to sort of reinforce your position and sort of entrap the enemy, that's going to be the best way to use the halberds. I think you're not going to be trying to hold off the enemy hordes with your own halberds. But really what puts Mordor so high on the list are their high-end toys. I haven't brought the Nazgul, but I have brought the uruk-hai. And their trolls in general are very good, but the uruk-hai in particular are just so devastating. They have their heavy armor, they also have hit points. It's so difficult to kill these guys off. And it's just it really makes you downcast when you see the uruk-hai just come in and smash through a carefully prepared defense that you've made. Particularly if you're playing the elves, these guys are your worst nightmare. They will do tons and tons of damage. Really, your best bet of fighting the uruk-hai is pikes and halberds and stuff like that, stuff that's good against armor. But even then, provided that the uruk-hai haven't just charged headlong into pikes, they're going to do a lot of damage regardless of what you do. And of course, they have Black Numenorians. This could easily be Nazgul as a general unit, but I think the Black Numenorians are just as good. If you keep them up in your army formation as you advance, you can then sort of split them off and start doing rear charges. It is difficult because the Black Numenorians can be swamped by enemy cav, but they are a very, very nasty unit provided you use them correctly. They're a cool looking unit too. But yeah, Mordor are the masters of the rush, really, in this game, because of the units they have available to them. But it's not really enough to get them any higher on the list, because all of the factions that are higher than them can basically counter that strategy almost perfectly, depending on how Mordor use their trolls. So we'll move on to number 4. So, at number 4 we have Dale, and for these last, well, from 2nd to 4th, I had to think of what the game respects most in terms of what units are more powerful. And I had to place Dale down in 4th because they have the worst heavy infantry and sort of that sort of main line heavy infantry and heavy cavalry of the 3 that occupy the spaces below first. And that was really why, like, their archers are easily the best of the factions we have left remaining, and that is a big boon to them because I think after heavy infantry and cavalry, the archers are the most important thing in 3rd Age. So if you enjoy playing as an archer-heavy faction, Dale may very well be your favourite one, because unlike the elves, with Dale you still have the option to field a decent-sized army with some varied strategies. So like you have some very good spears in the Gedrouts, you have some good shock infantry in the Swordmasters, you have pikes, which is very important as in the Barding Herd, you have the dismounted earls, and all of these are reasonably priced. As Dale, you actually will have some pretty good value for money. Not as good as value for money as someone like Harad has, for example. The Earls are a bit of a stumbling block when it comes to that. But nonetheless, you will be able to get a lot of bang for your buck with Dale. The Bardian Marksmen are an excellent archer unit. Only the Elven archers can really boast being better individually than these guys, and because of their value for money, there is a case for saying that the Bardian Marksmen are actually better than them. But again, that comes down to personal preference and whether you like the factions or not. I really like Dale. They're one of my favourite factions in the game. Their spears are also pretty good. The Gedrouts can be beaten by quite a few units though, so it's worth saying that these guys are just sort of going to be fulfilling the spear role in their very standard way, sort of blocking calves, zoning them out, patching in the line where they need to, and just sort of taking damage rather than dealing out. The Dale Swordsmasters are kind of the opposite of this philosophy. They will be doing a lot of damage, but they aren't particularly survivable themselves, so you've got to be careful with the Swordsmasters. But they can dish out the punishment very, very quickly if you use them correctly, so if you put them in amongst the spears or the pikes, for example, they will do an excellent job. The Barding Herd, they are a halberd unit, probably one of the best halberd units in the game, I would suggest. They aren't quite as good as stuff like the Loc Gamperim or the Guards of Osgiliath, certainly, but they will still do an excellent job at holding a line. They will do a lot of damage as well. Catching them out of formation isn't quite as disastrous either because they're not the very long spear units, but as a result of that, they aren't also as good at just taking the enemy head on either. So that's always something to be worth considering. Then you have the Elves, of course. I've mentioned before that the Elves are a very good heavy infantry unit. They will lose somewhat to quite a few other very high-end heavy infantry units. That's not to say they're a terrible unit in and of themselves. If you combine these guys with the fact that you have very good archers which can shoot down and equalize the fights, the Elves could very well win you a lot of battles based on how survivable they are. Of course, your general should probably be in a mounted Earls unit because they are a survivable heavy cav. They're not shock cav, but they will survive a great deal of time in melee where the regular shock cavalry would not. 8th Wodia are your shock cav. They haven't got quite as good a stats as some of the other shock cav in the game, but they are still very, very good. And I would suggest you probably want to bring these guys just to sort of keep your opponent on their toes, so that you can also use them to sort of protect your own archers by blocking off enemy cav in conjunction with your spears. Dale are a pretty defensive faction, honestly, but I enjoy playing them a lot. But they aren't quite as good as what is above them, in my opinion. And we'll move on to the top 3 now. So at number 3 we have my personal favourite faction in Gondor. Now, the difference between them and Dale is Dale have superior archers. Gondor's archers are okay, but they do lag behind Dale and Arnel's archers. But where Gondor have the advantage is obviously in their spears and their pikes in particular. Stuff like their Fountain Guard is extremely powerful, and their Guards of Osgiliath. Very, very good pike unit. However, really where the advantage is hammered home is within their infantry. Now, the Gondor infantry are very, very good basic infantry. They're not that much worse than the Elves, honestly, and this isn't even Gondor's best infantry. Because their best infantry, of course, are the dismounted Swan Knights. Now, these guys will do a very good job in sustained melee. They do a lot of damage. Putting them in with your pikes and your spears will give them the survivability they need to dish out said damage. You also have some very high tier polearms, as I said before. You have the Guards of Osgiliath, of course. You have the Gondor Spearmen and the Fountain Guard, and you also have the Citadel Guard, which are, I would say they're just a bit more versatile version of the Fountain Guard, who are perhaps not as good when the going gets tough, so to speak. But the Citadel Guard are still an excellent unit. They can form shield wall, of course, which is always a nice change. Gondor's big advantage over Dale really is they have a much more survivable, much more deadly infantry force, melee infantry force, and of course their cavalry. The mounted Swan Knights are second only to the Knights of Annúminas in terms of overall quality, and that is good because it gives Gondor a big advantage over pretty much everyone but Arnor. Swan Knights are very expensive, of course, but they are worth it because of how effective they are. And that really is Gondor in a nutshell. They have a lot of damage and a lot of survivability all in the right places. They do lack a little bit behind the two factions that are above them in terms of heavy infantry in particular, it must be said. But nonetheless, Gondor is still a faction which will be able to pull out a victory against any faction in the right hands. So we'll move on to number 2, I think. So, number 2, and we have Arnor. Now, Arnor have got probably better archers than Gondor. Well, not the Brandbrass archers, but certainly the Dunedain Rangers. But as Arnor, you will often find yourself skimping on your archer line because it is pretty expensive and you'll want to spend your money in other areas. So while the Dunedain Rangers are very, very good, you will probably be spending your money elsewhere. Now, one problem they do have when in relation to Gondor as well, while their Arnor pikemen are pretty affordable and pretty good, ultimately your spears and your polearms are not as good as Gondor or Dale's, so they are sort of like built on the same template, so to speak. But where your advantage really comes home is in your melee infantry. Now, the Arnor men-at-arms are the lowest tier you have. They're pretty equal to the Gondor infantry in terms of what they are. So pretty effective, pretty good. They're pretty affordable as well, it must be said. One of the only affordable units in your infantry line. You also have the battle-ready Dunedain. Now, you'll have these with Eriador as well. Very good shock infantry. In my opinion, the best shock infantry outside the Isengard Berserkers. Simply because they do a lot of damage and they seem to stay standing a lot. And they can be supported very easily with stuff such as your Arnor Militia. These are actually a pretty good spear unit. They are still militia, though. They can form shield wall, which is interesting, but nonetheless, they are still militia, so do use them carefully. They wear shorts as well, which is, interesting, I suppose. But really, the main event, of course, is the dismounted Dunedain Knights, at least on foot, anyway. These guys are very, very good. Very expensive, but very, very good. Mentioned in the same breath as the Smiths of Eregion, of course. I would say that you use these guys when your line is committed to sort of hammer the point home that you're going to win the infantry engagement, provided you've taken it favourably, so you've got the pikes at the front, you've got all your units engaged well, and you're not being outflanked. But of course, it's unlikely you're going to be outflanked because you have the best heavy cavalry force in the game, and this is what really puts them ahead of Gondor in terms of outright effectiveness. Knights of Annúminas, of course, better than the Swan Knights, but they have an easily massable, very elite cav force. Based on the Arnor Knights, of course, very, very good cav unit. They also will probably have to pad out a little bit with Arnor Sergeants, but these guys are pretty damn good as well. The only slight vulnerability they may have is if someone like Rohan or Harad brings some anti-cav javelin units and tries to use their more affordable cav to try and beat your much more expensive cav. But if you use them correctly, there's no reason you should be losing a cav engagement as Arnor. And then, of course, that gives you the license to just go around charging the enemy while your infantry slowly pushes them back as well. Really, there's only one faction which can outmuscle Arnor overall as a faction, and they are, of course, the ones that are at number 1. but nonetheless, there's a lot of good units that Arnel have at their disposal. Banderbrass archers are pretty decent for what they are as well, it must be said, so don't be afraid to sort of get some of the lower tier archers as Arnel, because you really want to be spending money elsewhere. Anyways, we will now move on to the faction which placed first, in my opinion, and in many other opinions as well. So, of course, number one is the Dwarves, and I've mentioned this quite a lot across my videos on Third Age, that I think that the Dwarves, and it's kind of not really debatable that the Dwarves are the strongest faction overall, simply because they fit in best to how the mechanics of the game work. Starting off, I suppose, with their front line, generally speaking, you're going to be coming up against Vault Wardens, and these guys are, of course, very, very good. They're not quite as good as the Gondor pikes, I don't think, but their heavy armor really helps them when it comes to dealing with arrows, which is the main bane of pike units like these. The Vault Warden's very, very good at dealing with infantry charges, of course. Cav charges should go without saying. You may also see some halberd men sort of backing them up, because the Vault Wardens can get pretty expensive when you try to mass them. So the halberd men may be interspersed with them, giving them a more solid line like this sort of thing. You might see quite a lot of the dwarves, because they're going to be wanting to be defensive, because that's what the dwarves are best at, but they can just come forth and crush you as well, so don't think that them being on the attack is a good thing, mainly because of units like this. The Axemen of Erebor, very damaging, still very difficult to kill. Just, you know, you can tell by the size of their axes that they mean business. Very heavy armor, of course, very damaging. Their only skirmish force is crossbows, which is perhaps a little bit of a problem, but then the dwarves are the best faction overall at resisting arrows, so really only the Elves and Dale will give them real pause when it comes to a skirmish. But still, the crossbows are very good at dealing with enemy cabs, so if you're playing a faction like Arnel or Rohan even, you're not going to be able to leverage your advantage quite as easily against a unit like the Iron Crossbowmen. They will be pretty good in a skirmish as well, provided you get into range and your army isn't out of position. More Axemen of Erebor. Now moving on to, you're going to need to use some filler in the Dwarven army if you're playing on reasonable funds, mainly because the Dwarven high tier units are of course very expensive. Dwarven warriors are good, you know, they're more survivable. You could also use Dwarven Axemen in place of these guys if you wanted a more attack-minded unit here, but really it doesn't really matter. They have very similar stats overall. It's just a case of one is 2 more points in attack, one is 2 more points in defense, and the Dwarven Axemen have got more charge, obviously. But yeah, I would use the Dwarven warriors just because I think the dwarves are better when you just outlast your opponent. But, you know, you can do some more damage with the Axemen if you so choose. And then, of course, you have the 3 units which really make them the best units, the best faction in the game. Of course, I've spoke about these guys before. The Dragon Slayers, you know, very, very good. Armor piercing. Probably the worst overall simply because they have the worst stats in melee. But they are still very, very good. You know, very hard to kill. 20 defense is nothing to be sniffed at. But of course then there's also the Iron Guard, which have 23 defense. You know, they don't have armor-piercing weapons, but they fit in. Again, it's kind of like the scenario with the Dwarven Warriors and the Dwarven Axemen. These guys are the more survivable version. They just do not die. The best unit at cleaning up trash, really, that there is. Because, you know, while they don't have armor-piercing weapons, they can just cleave through unarmored units like they weren't even there. And then, of course, in my opinion, the best single unit in the game overall, pound for pound, the Guards of Khazad-dûm. Now, my general's in this unit, so, you know, generally speaking, you'll probably only have one in a reasonable funds game because they are 1,000 and then the cost increases immediately. So unless you're going for a very elite small army in which you have multiple Guards of Khazad-dûm, you're probably only going to be seeing one, but one is more than enough at the center of your army. And this really, it's so difficult to break through. Even if you're Mordor, what are you going to do? Use your trolls to try and go through the pikes? It's not really going to work. And even if you go round, you can be bogged down in units which take a long time dying. If you're a skirmish faction, you can try and sit back and skirmish them, but ultimately they will move forward without taking too many casualties and then start engaging you with the crossbows. You know, it's difficult to see where to go. You know, even Cav, you know, you're going to have trouble. Like, Cav probably is the best way of going about it because the dwarves aren't particularly mobile. That is their main weakness. But even then, the crossbows are very good at dealing with Cav, and if they use their pikes in position well, it's going to be difficult for you to get around them. And if you get stuck in sustained melee against something like the Axemen of Erebor, your Cav is going to drop. The dwarves really have an infantry answer for everything, and that's what makes them the best, because of course, infantry is king in Third Age, and in Medieval too as a whole. But yeah, so that is pretty much it. That's all the reasons I can give that the dwarves are number one. So that was the top 10 factions in Third Age. I'm not sure if I'll be doing many more top 10s because otherwise it will just be making videos for the sake of it. I may still do the bodyguards and I may do light cav if there's enough material to go on there. Other than that, we'll see. We'll see. But you know, this was a pretty big video to do, and I hope that my opinion is received well. But yes, I hope to see you in the future.